Hello, this is Jeff Riddle, pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. And this podcast, I'm going to offer a draft of a book review that I have written. The book is by a guy named Frank Furedi, and it's titled Why Borders Matter. And it's subtitled Why Humanity Must Relearn the Art of Drawing Boundaries. This is published by Routledge in 2021. And the book is 193 pages in length. And again, I'm presenting this just as a draft of the review. This book was recommended to me by my friend A.J. McDonald back in the fall of 2021. And I got the book. Of course, it came out in that year. And I had it with me on the plane, actually. It was my plane reading when I went to London to Met Tab back in November. So I read a good chunk of it on the plane, and then I finally finished it, I think in late January, February. Then I wrote this review. I'm going to send it in to one of the journals for which I write reviews. It's kind of a different book for me because it's not a theology book, nor is it a book on bibliology. It's a work on sociology. But A.J. McDonald had suggested to me that actually there was a lot in it that was applicable to the whole debate about the texts of Scripture and whether or not it was right to insist on, for example, there being a defined canonical text of the books of Scripture. And so I agree with him after reading the book that I think there is a lot that is applicable for theology, for ethics, and even for issues related to the text of Scripture. So I'm just going to read for you my draft of this review. I may offer a few asides along the way, but probably not too many. And I hope that this will provide some helpful food for thought as we think about these issues related to boundaries and borders. So here's the review. The mere title of this book, Why Borders Matter, might lead one to think that it is about immigration, a topic much in the news these days. In fact, however, though applicable to immigration, this book is about much more than that. It is about borders or boundaries as a salubrious sociological phenomenon meant to establish order and promote flourishing in human individuals and societies. Borders are important not only in distinguishing one nation from another, but in demarcating boundaries in numerous other crucial areas of life, including the differences between the public and private spheres, between adults and children, between males and females, and even between humans and animals. The author, an emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent in the United Kingdom, brings the requisite expertise required to examine this topic with authority. This work challenges the contemporary promotion of what he calls a borderless spirit as the ideal. So let's move on to some review of the content of the book. We begin with a summary of the book's content. In the opening chapter, or introduction, the author suggests that there is a contemporary paradox of borders, epitomized in those who reject border walls on one hand, while decrying cultural appropriation on the other. And I might add, this is a theme throughout the book, that whereas on one hand there are people saying we need to have a borderless spirit, there shouldn't be any borders or boundaries, but he's saying it's such an innate sort of human impulse that even those who reject borders or boundaries will impose other ones. So he talks about how, there are people who would decry, say, Trump and build a wall. But on the other hand, then they're wanting to guard, cultural boundaries and say, Westerners shouldn't culturally appropriate the practices of non-Western cultures or things like that. Contrary to the spirit of the age, Furedi suggests that the creation of boundaries is vital. He notes, quote, "The marking out of space and the tendency to draw lines constitutes humanity's need for signposts and guidance, end quote, page 5. This is true not just of physical, but also of symbolic boundaries, including moral ones. Furedi says, quote, when symbolic borders lose their meaning, a cultural crisis ensues, end quote, page 7. According to Furedi, quote, Western society's estrangement from borders is not an enlightened step forward. Rather, it expresses a self-destructive sensibility of estrangement from the conventional signposts that guide everyday life, end quote, page 12. So again, this is a discussion not just about physical borders, but about what he talks about as sort of symbolic, sociological boundaries. And he says that when those boundaries are ignored or violated, that it causes confusion, cultural confusion. Chapter 2 addresses challenges represented by the modern value of so-called non-judgmentalism, presented, quote, as an enlightened and liberal attitude towards the world, end quote, page 19. Furedi, however, defends what he calls the act of judgment as, quote, a deed through which people can establish connections and establish a shared understanding of one another's outlook, end quote, page 20. So again, he's saying it's actually fundamental to the human experience to be able to make judgments about things, to make judgments about what's proper, what's not proper, what category to put different things in life into. And so he condemns then the rejection of borders or boundaries, because he says when we do this, again, it causes a chaotic experience. And he applies it in particular to moral judgment. If there is non-judgmentalism that says you can't make any moral judgments, then this leads to moral indifference. And so that's the big focus in chapter 2. Chapter 3 examines openness as a predominant modern value. So you got non-judgmentalism as a predominant modern value, and you've got openness, so-called openness as a predominant modern value. He writes on page 31, quote, in popular culture, openness supposedly rejects preconceived notions, refuses to possess durable commitments and ideas, and does not abide by fixed points and permanent boundaries, end quote. The converse of openness with non-judgmentalism has resulted in what Furedi calls a mood of moral malaise, page 33. Oddly enough, advocates of these values often express bitter hostility, that is, quote, visceral and characteristically militant, end quote, to any who see value in, quote, closed communities, end quote, based on, quote, ties of kinship, family, friendship, religion, and community membership, end quote, pages 36 and 37. So again, it's sort of a paradox, to say the least, that those who advocate openness, on the other hand, can become very bitter in opposing any who seem to have, a clear affinity or want to be part of a closed community, whether that's recognizing your family or kinship ties that you have or religious ties, that there's a hostility against that, while at the same time they're promoting so-called openness. Chapter 4 further addresses how these values have challenged notions of national sovereignty, democracy, and citizenship. So chapter 4 is the chapter where he really applies this to politics. These new values question what he calls the project of delegitimizing territorial borders, or his approach rather, Furedi's approach, questions the project of delegitimizing territorial borders. According to Furedi, belonging to a particular people inhabiting a bounded place constitutes, quote, an important source of solidarity, end quote, and provides, quote, moral significance for members of a national community, end quote, page 53. There can be no democracy, according to Furedi, without a demos, and demos is the Greek word for a people. So you can't have a democracy unless there's a demos, unless there's a people. Advocates for the new values, however, promote, quote, global citizenship, end quote, preferring, quote, a heterogeneous space to a homogeneous one, end quote, page 65. So again, this is the application of these ideas to politics. And he's saying there's something good about belonging to a nation. There's something good about belonging to a clear cultural group, a clear people group. And it's not necessarily a negative to be part of a more homogeneous group of people. Chapter 5 addresses the erosion of boundaries between the public and private spheres. So now in this chapter, he's going to move away from politics and talk simply about the need for a human need for boundaries between what we do in public and what we do in private. On page 73, he says, personal and emotional openness are regarded as cultural ideals and promoted through media and popular culture. So he's saying now we live in a culture where everyone thinks the greatest thing to do is to share your private thoughts openly and have open expressions of emotion and so forth. And he says the classical virtue of Stoicism has been replaced by public and unrestrained emotionalism, page 74. He cites as an example, quote, the relentless drive to normalize, routinize, and demystify the domain of sex, end quote, page 76. Pornography, for example, quote, has become a culturally, even socially validated fetish, end quote, page 76. I might note that throughout the book, he often talks about how pornography and its widespread acceptance, its easy access to it, is an example of there being a breakdown of boundaries and borders in our societies that has a negative consequence in people's lives. To continue the review here on the content of chapter 5, the old value of reticence is dismissed as prudishness. In contrast, Furedi suggests, quote, the protection of the private realm is essential for the conduct of a healthy public life, end quote, page 85. He concludes the chapter on page 88 by saying, once the space for secrecy is lost, the individual's capacity to question, doubt, and act in accordance with their inclinations is undermined. In this area, as in others, the flourishing of freedom is inseparable from the maintenance of limits and boundaries. Chapter 6 addresses how the erosion of the public and private distinction has had unsettling effects in public life. This has included the development of identity politics and charges of microaggressions, page 100. Chapter 7 addresses how, quote, the boundaryless spirit of our time, end quote, has created confusion for intergenerational relations. In the post-traditional world, the self is made rather than, quote, passively inherited, end quote, page 113. One result has been, quote, a diminished sense of adult responsibility, end quote, and, quote, the phenomenon of infantilization, end quote, page 115, leading to the erosion of parental authority, the tendency to treat children as adults, and of adults to act like children. A side effect has been the failure to socialize children and a confusion as to what values to transmit to them. And this really was an interesting discussion. Um, has a discussion of some terms that I hadn't heard before. He talks about the term kidult, uh, treating children like adults, and on the other hand, he has the term adolescent, treating adults like adolescents. And he has a little section where he talks about uh, that among some young people, they talk about adulting. They're young adults, but they don't want to take on. They still want to be, treated like children, but sometimes they have to take on adult responsibilities, and so they sort of play act as adults, while really they want to think of themselves still as being adolescents. So it's an interesting discussion of how there's an erosion of boundaries between the younger generation and the older generation. People don't want to take on the responsibilities of being adults. Chapter 8 addresses the current hostility against the practice of so-called binary thinking and the dismissal of binary thinking as, quote, morally wrong, end quote, page 130. Furedi writes on page 132, quote, binary thinking is sometimes presented as a psychological deficit, a symptom of anxiety, and a marker for intolerance of ambiguity and complexity, end quote. So what he's saying is that there's a tendency among those who are breaking down borders and boundaries to say that if you insist on a binary, let's say right, wrong, true, false, that they claim that you're taking a morally wrong position, and what you're doing is just projecting your own anxiety or your intolerance for any sort of ambiguity and complexity. And I thought about that in particular with respect to some of the interactions I've had with some advocates of modern textual criticism, because sometimes their response to those who are advocating for the received text is, you just can't be, satisfied, or you can't be, you're just anxious about ambiguity and complexity. And if you would just, be, content with ambiguity and complexity, you wouldn't be trying to define what the text of Scripture is. And so they try to come up with some psychological reason as to why one would want to embrace the received text. Let me continue the summary of chapter 8. According to Furedi, however, binary thinking is not simply a, quote, cultural tool, end quote, but a fundamental feature of the practice of human conceptualization, end quote, page 136. He notes in particular how, quote, anti-binary activists, end quote, have attacked the basic human distinctions between men and women. They have attempted, quote, authorizing not just gender, but also the difference of biological sex, end quote, with, quote, the character of a religious duty, end quote, page 142. So he's saying it's this modern sense of doing away with borders and boundaries, symbolic boundaries, that is behind, for example, the impulse to want to eliminate the distinction, the basic distinction between men and women as the two fundamental types of human beings with respect to sexuality. Chapter 9 suggests the rejection of conventional boundaries has, in fact, ironically resulted in, quote, new ways of drawing lines in everyday life, end quote, page 151. This includes emphasis on personal boundaries, the Me Too movement, and the desire for so-called safe spaces. So on one hand, again, it's this paradox of boundaries. The people who are saying we shouldn't have any borders, we shouldn't have any boundaries, we shouldn't have any differences between men and women or young and old, etc. They're also saying, but we need safe spaces. We need a boundary where we can be safe from people who disagree with us, for example. The book ends with a conclusion, noting again that, quote, hostility towards conventional boundaries and borders coexists with the demands for new borders. Furedi notes that some are even challenging the boundaries between humans and animals. Human morality is dismissed by some as, quote, an anthropocentric conceit, end quote, page 165. He concludes that, quote, the decisive influence, end quote, in the West's unwillingness to affirm clear borders in all areas is, quote, a lack of clarity about the moral values that underpin the self, end quote, page 173. And this reminds me, there's actually a lot in this book that I think fits with the book from Carl Trueman about the modern concept of the self. Some final analysis. This is a work of sociology and not theology proper, and yet it contains many helpful insights for the church today. Furedi offers a compelling description and analysis of the contemporary zeitgeist from a sociological perspective and its rebellion against traditional boundaries or borders with respect not only to nations, and this made me think of the quotation in Acts 17:26 when Paul is at Mars Hill about how God has made each nation to exist within its borders or boundaries. So it not only addresses that, but also it addresses issues with respect to the fundamental difference between men and women, between adults and children, etc. At one point, Furedi makes reference to the inherent binary convictions of traditional Christianity when he writes on page 134, quote, Christianity makes a clear distinction between those who follow Christ and those who fail to believe, end quote. And so what he's saying is that Christianity is inherently a binary sort of religion because it talks about those who are believers and those who are not believers. Key to Furedi's argument is the idea that even those who reject traditional borders paradoxically invent new ones to replace them. This recalls Paul's insight that even pagan Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, which show the work of the law written in their hearts. That's from Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. This book challenges the Christian reader to consider not only how to understand and resist the spirit of this age as it works upon us, but also how to extend a winsome alternative in biblical Christianity to a confused world. So this ends the draft of my review. Again, I think it has some kind of intriguing insights for understanding not only theology, not only for understanding sort of the inherent boundaries that exist in the Christian worldview, like that between believers and unbelievers, but also for understanding a Christian view of the text of Scripture, that it does serve as an important boundary for the Christian faith. And if the Christian scriptures are not clearly defined, and the boundaries are undermined and washed away, then that hurts the integrity of biblical Christianity if there is no Bible to serve as a standard for faith and practice. Well, this brings, again, this episode to a conclusion. I hope that there are some things in this review that have been helpful, and I'll look forward to speaking to you in future podcasts. Till then, take care and God bless.